Everybody, welcome again. I'm Garry Adelman with the American Battlefield Trust. We got Chris White behind the camera, and if I were to combine sort of history and meaning and a few other factors together, this is definitely one of my favorite places to come. We're standing on the breakthrough battlefield, but we're not only standing on the breakthrough battlefield, this is a battlefield that is special, if not unique. And I don't use that word lightly because you've heard of other places like Manassas or Cold Harbor and Gaines's Mill where you get a twofer. Well, here we get a threefer. 3 different engagements on the same piece of ground that are going to happen between the fall of 1864 or late summer into April of 1865. And we're going to be talking about these engagements with a focus on what I mentioned first, the breakthrough, the most consequential attack of the entire Civil War. Show me another one that resulted in the fall of the Confederate capital at Richmond. So to talk about all this, we're fortunate. We've got our good friend Will Greene, co-founder of American Battlefield Trust, prolific writer about Petersburg and the guru on the subject. So welcome, sir.
Thank you, Garry. It's really an honor to be with you. It's an honor to be on this land that the American Battlefield Trust preserved. The Trust is doing such a great job. It just makes me so humble to think that when we started battlefield preservation, we had no idea that it would grow to what you all have done here. And the fact that you're interpreting the property that you save makes it even better. Yeah. So it's terrific to be here.
And before I let you launch into stuff, let me just explain what we're looking at since you brought it up here. We're standing in what would have been a field here about 15, 20 years ago, but it was open at the time as well, but it would have been surrounded by woods. Everything in your field of vision outside this field here would have been woods, okay? And the American Battlefield Trust, plus with the help of some local partners and whatnot, after purchasing this land, eventually cleared more than 80 acres of land and returned it to farmland. And that is not easy to do, nor cheap. And we did it, installed an interpretive trail. We'll show you one of the signs here. And we cover the threefer of the battles here. And again, what we call the breakthrough, if I'm correct, was named by our good friend Chris Calkins, who knew that it needed to sound better, and came up with a breakthrough. And the Trust does this sometimes as we send these things out to our members. I made up the epicenter at Antietam for that same purpose. So Will, let's start with the first of the threefers. The troops have been slugging it out all throughout the summer of 1864, and Grant is trying to extend his line and stretch Lee to the west, and there's going to be a fight around here in September.
Well, interestingly enough, the first of these 3 battles is the largest and arguably the least significant of all of the 3 battles here. It was known as the Battle of People's Farm, or the Battle of Pegram's Farm, the First Battle of Jones' Farm. It has a number of different names, but it was the focal point of the 5th Union offensive at Petersburg. Now, as Garry indicated, the Union efforts to capture Petersburg had a transition point after the Battle of the Crater, the so-called Third Petersburg Offensive. At that point, Grant decided that it was not going to be very feasible just to break into the Petersburg line. So instead, he focused explicitly on cutting off all the lines of communication and supply into Petersburg and Richmond. His first target was the Petersburg or Weldon Railroad, which he was able to capture and close down in August during the 4th offensive. And the 5th offensive in September, late September of 1864, was designed to try to reach the remaining 2 Confederate lines of communication, the Boydton Plank Road and the South Side Railroad. It would not succeed in doing that, but it would succeed in extending the Union line about 3 more miles to the west, and consequently forcing General Lee to extend his attenuated army farther to the west as well. And so, to make a long story short, very complicated battle. The best book on it is a book by Richard Summers called Richmond Redeemed. I cover this 5th offensive in a couple of chapters in my forthcoming 2nd volume of the Petersburg battlefield. The Union Army made several attacks across this field. They reached beyond where you see the water tower today, up onto a knoll that was occupied by a magnificent home that was burned later called the Jones House. But then the Confederates counterattacked. Just to the east of us, on the other side of this wood line, is a wartime road called the Church Road. That was kind of the axis of the Confederate assaults that came back across this field, almost up to that far wood line, when Chris can pan over in that direction. And the outcome of this fighting was that the Federals were able to hold what they had gained back here but not their forward advance. And so they extended their line and constructed fortifications that are a part of the National Park Service now, places like Fort Fisher, Fort Welch, Union Fort Gregg. And there would be one more Union offensive in the fall, the 6th Offensive in late October, and that pretty much ended the combat in 1864.
Good, thank you, Will. And what's going to happen then is that both sides then adapt to their new lines. We've got lines, you know, as you said, Fort Welch, and named after Norvell Welch. Sometimes they name forts after people who had died in the struggle.
They always named forts after people who died. You did not want a fort named after you at Petersburg.
Indeed. So the U.S. troops start aligning in the distance at that tree line there. In the meantime, the Confederates want to keep them at bay, keep them away from the South-South Railroad, keep them away from the Boyd and Plank Road. So they're going to establish right here, right where we stand, a picket line here that they're going to occupy as late as March of 1865. You see where that sign is that Chris is showing? We're going to show you that soon enough. In fact, let's start to walk over that way because the field has flattened it, but on both sides of the field, these earthworks still remain. Now, a lot of people, including E.P. Alexander, would suggest that there's a big turning point. The beginning of the end is when Grant turned south after the Wilderness, or after Grant moved toward Petersburg, according to E.P. Alexander, right? You know, so, but Will Greene has increasingly convinced me that smaller actions that happened as a result of the Battle of Fort Stedman on March 25th, 1865, so we're zooming forward a little bit, are going to be even more consequential. So, Will, take it away.
Well, as Garry mentioned, the people who are familiar with the Petersburg campaign, if you mention March 25th, they'll think of Lee's last grand offensive, that large attack against Fort Stedman and the adjacent earthworks, which eventually wound up as a very dismal failure for the Confederates. The real significance of March 25th, in my view, is what happened afterwards, in the afternoon of March 25th. As a result of the failed Confederate attacks at Fort Stedman, that sucked in a number of troops from out here on the western side of the Petersburg defenses. General Meade indicated to his 2 corps commanders who were out here in the west, Horatio Wright in command of the 6th Corps and Andrew Atkinson Humphreys in command of the 2nd Corps, that they should probe forward to see if the Confederates had indeed weakened their lines here and an opportunity to capture the Boyd and Plank Road had presented itself. And Humphreys, whose land is not preserved, it's much farther to the west, he immediately took the bit and made an attack and captured the Confederate picket line. General Wright was a little more hesitant. He finally got going about 1:30 in the afternoon, but he only advanced with about 1,200 men, about 3 regiments, sort of probing forward. And that probe was turned back by the Confederate picket line and by a brigade of South Carolinians commanded by General Samuel McGowan. Well, then Wright received orders from Meade to make a more determined assault. And this would involve an entire brigade supplemented by those 3 regiments which had attacked earlier, a brigade commanded by the future Speaker of the House of Representatives from Ohio, J. Warren Keifer. And Keifer's men would attack across these open fields against this Confederate picket line. And they captured that Confederate picket line. Now, if you think the rebels had just about shot their bolt, don't think that, because they still had fight in them. And there were 2 Confederate regiments from E.L. Thomas's Georgia Brigade, the 49th and the 45th Georgia, made a counterattack against Keifer's men, but they were unsuccessful, and the Federals were able to hold the Confederate picket line. Now, we have preserved what's left here, which is only about 150 or 200 yards of these works, but they're unusual. They're not unique. We've seen this before, but they're unusual in that they are the Confederate works that have been refaced by the Federals to look to the north. The Confederate line, of course, is looking south. The Union line now is looking north, and it's the same line of works. And what's significant about this, Garry, is that it covers about 600 yards between the prior Union picket line and the new Union picket line, which means that half the distance to the main Confederate works protecting the Boyd and Plank Road are now in Union control. And I would argue as did General Wright and other Union officers, that this was the decisive action that set up the final attack on April 2nd.
Good, and I'll tell you what, if you've got 1,200 yards, that means you can move your picket line 600 yards to the enemy. Now the Confederates not only have their main line, but their picket line is pushed right up close to their main line as well.
Excellent point.
Good, and I'll foreshadow a little bit. You mentioned J. Warren Keifer, who we sometimes talk about at 3rd Winchester, if I'm correct. Right. We're going to hear from him in an attack at Sailor's Creek when we shoot video as part of this series out there as well. So something to look forward to as well. So now the Union has it within their power to get closer to the Confederates, okay? All of a sudden, a few things happen. We have the Battle of White Oak Road on March 31st. We have the Battle of Five Forks. That you've already hopefully watched that video on April 1st, and the Union knows that Lee is stretched beyond his ability to stop, so they're going to have an opportunity here.
Well, they are, and of course Grant now smells blood. Once he learns that the Confederate line at Five Forks has been captured, the road to the South Side Railroad is now open, Grant wants to land the killing blow. And he gives orders to all of his corps on the line. The 9th Corps over on the east side and to the south of Petersburg, the 6th Corps right here, and the 2nd Corps to their left, along with elements of the 24th and 25th Corps from the Army of the James that have come down secretly, snuck away from north of the James right under James Longstreet's nose without Longstreet finding out. All of these Union troops are going to wind up making an assault at dawn on April the 2nd. And the attack that is the most successful, and the first one to be successful, was the attack of the 6th Corps. And that occurred right on the ground that the American Battlefield Trust has preserved, adjacent to the land at Pamplin Historical Park, which is now preserved. And so we have a wonderful battlefield experience that you can walk, thanks to the American Battlefield Trust. You can walk from the Union line, a thin strip of earthworks wonderfully preserved by the National Park Service, across American Battlefield Trust land onto Pamplin Historical Park land, and basically reenact all of the fighting that occurred on this most decisive day of the Civil War.
And let me just say that, this is how you win wars. We talked at Five Forks about it being 7 p.m. when General Warren arrives on astride the Confederate retreat route or astride their line. And this attack is being planned immediately, and it's going to come off some 10 hours later. Just within 10 hours, you're going to get a whole corps moving. Take that. Imagine in 1861, someone saying, we're going to be moving corps around and doing things like this, and stage this 6th Corps attack in a tight wedge so that they can move forward and break the Confederate line, which was, by the way, still a pretty bloody struggle. This breakthrough didn't just happen.
Well, there's going to be more than 1,000 Union casualties here in about 15 or 20 minutes of attacking. So that's a pretty brutal assault. But as Garry knows, the 6th Corps and the 2nd Corps were anticipating such orders. And I guess the key to the success of the breakthrough attack was to how are you going to get 3 divisions of troops tightly packed together in the dark to make an attack simultaneously without running into one another? How do you keep lines straight? And this is one of the values of preserving land, because there are little terrain features that make a big difference in the outcome of battles. And here at the breakthrough, there was a small ravine drained by a branch of a little sluggish stream called Arthur's Swamp, which acted sort of like when the flight attendants tell you that in the case of a loss of power, lights will illuminate along the aisle to lead you to the exits. That branch of Arthur's Swamp was sort of like those lights. It was the anchor on which the Union lines were fixed. And so that the 6th Corps' Getty's division would anchor its left flank on that ravine. And everybody then would move to the right of Getty, that'd be Wheaton's division, and Seymour's division to the left with their right flank on that ravine. And they would use that ravine as their guide to go forward. The attack begins with a massive artillery bombardment that started about 10 p.m. on April the 1st. The Confederates reported it was the most spectacular bombardment they had experienced in the entire war. It lasted until about 1 o'clock. The Federal lines then move out quietly across this ground, trying not to make any noise. They come up to the Union picket line, and the attack orders are for 4 o'clock in the morning. But Wright thinks it's a little too dark. He can't really see anything, so he waits until 4:40. And then he sends a courier back to Fort Fisher, where Romeo Stewart and the 3rd Vermont Battery fires the signal shot that launches this assault. They come across this ground. The Confederates hear them before they can see them, really. The Confederate pickets fire a volley or two and then do the logical thing and run back to their main line, which means that the Confederates in the main line have to wait until those pickets have cleared. And incidentally, the Confederates on that main line are pretty thin.
Yeah.
They're standing about 6 feet apart. It's North Carolinians entirely. 4 regiments of Lane's North Carolina Brigade and 2 regiments of the 11th and the 52nd North Carolina are to the right there. So 6 Confederate regiments.
Experienced troops here, but thin.
Experienced troops, but thin. And of course the attack is slowed down by several lines of abattis. General Wright has made provision for that, however, as men armed with axes, not with rifles, are sent ahead to chop holes through the abattis. Here's where the Confederate attack looks like it might be in trouble, because lots of casualties are taken while the attackers are waiting for that abattis, the Civil War version of barbed wire, to be cleared. But then once it's cleared, the Federals move forward, they climb into the ditch, up over the parapet, and engage in a brief but brutal hand-to-hand combat. And within 5 minutes of that time, the Confederates are overwhelmed and the Confederate line is broken in two.
Now, people tend to not know this too. There's a lot that happens after that. We're not going to cover all of it, but the Union has been instructed not to just move forward and capture the railroad, but rather certain units are supposed to fan out toward Hatcher's Run and other things like that. Could you say a
That's
little
right.
bit about
Most
that?
of there's 8 Federal brigades involved in this assault. 7 of them turn to the left and begin rolling up the Confederate line all the way to Hatcher's Run. And incidentally, there are a number of those Confederate forts that are still extant, some of which are on private property, some of which have been preserved by the American Battlefield Trust. It's a spectacular walk to see all of these forts, like Fort Alexander, Fort Davis. But they are able to roll up the rest of those Confederate brigades, who then stream off to the west. 1 Union brigade, Hamlin's brigade, remains on the right to hold off any Confederates coming to attack them from the east.
Yeah, let's point toward there a little bit as
Okay.
you talk.
And then once the 6th Corps has gone all the way to Hatcher's Run, then they turn around 180 degrees and start heading up along the Boyden Plank Road. They're joined by 2 divisions of the 24th Corps. Now there is a black division on the battlefield. They're not involved in a lot of combat, but most people don't realize that William Birney's division of the 25th Corps, African-American soldiers were on the ground here and did engage on the fringes of the battle. Standing in the way of the 6th Corps was a line of artillery around Lee's headquarters, a place called Edge Hill along the Cox Road. The 6th Corps would attack that and overwhelm those artillery pieces. Standing in the way of the 24th Corps were 2 small forts known as Fort Gregg and Fort Whitworth.
Yeah.
And the best book on that is called The Confederate Alamo.
Aptly named.
And it's aptly named because it's a tragic story. If you are at all sensitive about the loss of human life and bravery, you'd have to tip your kepi to both the Union attackers, who lose 714 men attacking this small fort, and the Confederate defenders, all of whom are either killed, wounded, or captured in the defense of Fort Gregg and Fort Whitworth, particularly at Fort Gregg. However, they traded their lives for time because Lee had summoned Longstreet to bring Charles Field's division down from the north side of the James to reinforce the beleaguered Confederates here around Petersburg. And as Fort Gregg collapses, the leading brigades of Field's division arrives on the field, takes position in Battery 45, or Fort Lee, which is also extant, preserved in the National Battlefield Park. And at that point, the Union attackers have pretty much run out of steam, but they have split the Confederate line in two. General Lee, by 10:40 in the morning, has notified President Davis in Richmond that he is going to be compelled to evacuate Petersburg that night, if he can hold on that long, and that he advises the president to evacuate the government in Richmond that day as well.
And you know, there's a lot going on, and thank you, Will. This sets up what we're going to be talking about a lot now, because of course this is going to set up Robert E. Lee's movement to the west, his attempted movement to the south to link up with Joseph E. Johnston, but this is going to set up what we would call the Appomattox campaign. Of course, we're going to visit some of these places, not all of them, but we know we're going to head to Sailor's Creek. We know we're going to head to High Bridge. We know we're going to go to Appomattox Station and Appomattox Courthouse, unless weather gets in the way or something like that. So this sets it up pretty well. And again, the most consequential attack of the Civil War, the breakthrough right here that results within hours of Lee calling for the evacuation of Petersburg and Richmond.
292 days of combat, and I will just say that semantics are just that, and I am not offended when people refer to the action around Petersburg as a siege. Many of the soldiers refer to it as a siege, and that's perfectly fine. But I prefer to think of it as a campaign, because there were no fewer than 79 named engagements around Petersburg between June 15th and April 2nd. And this was a dynamic campaign that involved tactics, strategy, and brutal combat, in addition to the bone-wearying, disease-ridden suffering of people in trenches. So don't just think of the Petersburg story as one of boring trench warfare. It was an active campaign that is as complicated and as interesting as any in the Civil War.
And the more you learn about it, if you call it boring, you are reading the wrong books or something like that. So hopefully these videos are getting you a little bit excited to make a visit to some of these places. We hope you walk this trail. We hope you visit Five Forks. We hope you visit some of the other places, and we hope to see y'all here at 160 at some of these places as we're out in the field, as you're out in the field. So thanks so much, Will.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much to Chris White behind the camera. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you click that subscribe button on YouTube. Like our videos if you can. Share them with your friends so all of us can engage more with this fascinating history. And thanks for everything you do for battlefield preservation and education.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.